All right, you beautiful bastards. Ever wonder how the U.S. throws its weight around without actually starting World War III?
Hmm. Interesting question.
It's sanctions, baby. Basically, it's Uncle Sam's way of telling other countries, do what we say or we'll fuck up your economy.
Yeah.
We've got an expert here who actually knows this shit.
Well, I wouldn't say I know all of it.
So let's cut the crap and dive into this clusterfuck.
Well, you're right about one thing. The U.S. is basically the king of sanctions. They impose way more than any other country.
So they're like the biggest bullies on the playground.
You could say that. Think of it like a giant toolbox full of ways to punish anyone who pisses them off.
A whole arsenal of economic weapons.
Exactly. And there are different tools for different situations. You've got your classic financial sanctions where they target a country's banks and make it hard for them to do business internationally.
Like freezing their assets.
Yep. They can freeze assets, restrict access to systems like SWIFT, and even slap travel bans on key individuals.
So basically making it a bitch for them to move money around.
Pretty much. Then there are trade sanctions where they restrict imports and exports.
So they screw with a country's ability to buy or sell stuff.
Exactly. And of course, there's the arms embargo where they try to stop the flow of weapons to a country.
Oh, right, like trying to keep those nut jobs in North Korea from getting their hands on even more nukes,
Yeah,
right?
precisely. But then things get really hardcore when you talk about comprehensive
Oh,
sanctions.
lay it on me.
Imagine a country basically cut off from the U.S. entirely, no trade, no financial transactions, nothing.
Damn. Which countries are getting this you're in time out treatment?
Well, you've got the usual suspects like Cuba, Iran, and North Korea. They've been dealing with comprehensive sanctions for decades.
Talk about holding a grudge.
And now, with the whole Ukraine situation, Russia's joined the party.
So the U.S. basically nuked their economy. Is that even legal?
Well, the use of comprehensive sanctions really ramped up during the Cold War, and they've become a go-to tool for the U.S. But yeah, they're controversial as hell because they can cause serious pain for ordinary people.
Right. It's not like Putin and his cronies are the ones going hungry when the U.S. sanctions Russia.
Exactly. That's why there's a huge debate about how effective these sanctions actually are. Some experts argue that they're mostly useless and just cause suffering.
So we're just making their citizens suffer for nothing?
Well, while others say they're a necessary evil to pressure bad actors on the world stage.
Okay, so it's a tough call. It's fucked up, but I guess sometimes you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet, right?
Right.
But you mentioned targeted sanctions earlier.
Right.
How the hell do you sanction a specific person without screwing over their whole country?
That's where the SDN list comes in. The specially designated nationals and blocked persons list.
SDM.
Yeah. It's basically a U.S. government hit list of individuals they consider terrorists, criminals, or human rights abusers.
So like a naughty list for international asshats.
Pretty much.
Hmm.
Anyone on this list has their assets frozen, and U.S. citizens and businesses can't do business with them.
Makes sense.
It's a way to target individuals without punishing the entire population.
So if some Russian oligarch is funding Putin's war, they can put his ass on the SDN list and freeze his assets. Make him feel the pain.
Exactly. It's a way to hit them where it hurts their wallets.
Nice. But let's be real. Do these sanctions actually work? Or are we just pissing people off for no reason?
That's a question with a very complicated answer.
I mean,
I mean, look at Russia. Didn't those sanctions backfire and push them closer to China? There's conflicting evidence about the effectiveness of sanctions in general, and the situation with Russia is particularly complex.
so basically, we don't know.
It's true that Russia's economy hasn't completely collapsed, and they strengthened ties with China, but it's too early to say for sure what the long-term impact will be.
So we might not know for a while if those sanctions are working.
Right.
What about other examples? Have there been any major wins?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms of sanctions is that they often hurt innocent people.
Yeah, I could see that.
For example, in places like Cuba and Venezuela, sanctions have led to shortages of food and medicine.
Shit, that's fucked up. We're trying to punish the bad guys, but we end up screwing over regular people.
It's a tough balance. And then there's the whole issue of secondary sanctions.
Secondary sanctions, what the hell is that?
Basically, it means the U.S. can punish companies or individuals from other countries if they do business with sanctioned entities, even if they're not American.
Wait, so the U.S. is trying to control what other countries do?
That's essentially what's happening.
That's some next-level bullshit.
You can see why this pisses off a lot of countries, even close allies like those in Europe. They feel like the U.S. is overstepping its boundaries and trying to dictate to the whole world.
That's like the U.S. is the world's hall monitor, but on some serious power trip.
And it's actually led to some countries trying to find ways to ditch the US dollar and do business without relying on the US financial system. It's called de-dollarization, and it's a potential threat to US dominance.
So other countries are basically saying, screw you, US, we're going to use our own money.
That's the gist of it. They don't want to get caught in the crossfire of these sanctions, so they're looking for ways to break free from the US-dominated system.
That's pretty badass, actually. Okay, so we've talked about these different types of sanctions, the SDN list and this whole secondary sanctions mess. But what are some real-world examples of how these sanctions are being used right now? Give us the juicy stuff.
Well, one major area is trying to stop the flow of weapons to conflict zones. For example, the U.S. has sanctions against countries like Syria and Yemen to prevent them from getting more arms.
Makes sense. The last thing those places need is more firepower.
They're also cracking down on international criminal organizations like the Yakuza in Japan and drug cartels in Mexico.
So they're going after the mob and drug lords. Sounds like a scene straight out of a movie.
It's not always glamorous, that's for sure. And then there are sanctions aimed at punishing human rights abusers. You'll see this with countries like China and Myanmar, where the U.S. has targeted officials involved in genocide and ethnic cleansing.
Damn, that's some heavy shit. So basically, the U.S. is trying to clean up the world's mess with these sanctions.
It's a complicated situation, and the U.S. definitely has its own interests at play. But they do often see themselves as having a responsibility to intervene in situations where they believe international peace or security is at stake.
Right, like they're the world's police swooping in to save the day. But why does it always have to be the U.S.? Don't we have, like, the UN and other organizations for that?
Those organizations definitely play a role, but they often rely on the U.S. for support, and sometimes the U.S. just decides to go it alone, especially when they don't have international backing.
Like when they invaded Iraq. Yeah, that didn't exactly go to plan.
Right. There are definitely examples where U.S. intervention has been controversial and even harmful. But there are also times when sanctions have been used to achieve positive outcomes, like pressuring countries to release political prisoners or stop human rights abuses.
So it's a mixed bag, I guess. Sometimes it works, sometimes it blows up in their faces.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that the U.S. isn't the only country that uses sanctions. Many countries use them to some extent.
True. But the U.S. definitely takes the cake for being the most prolific user, and they're not afraid to get creative with it. We talked about the SDN list, but what other weird sanctions are they using?
Oh, there are some strange ones out there. Did you know the U.S. has sanctions against certain types of tuna fishing?
Tuna fishing? What the fuck? Are they trying to control the ocean now?
It's part of an effort to protect endangered species. They also have sanctions against the illegal trade in ivory and rhino horn, which makes more sense.
Okay, so it's not all bad, but it seems like the U.S. has a sanctions program for just about everything these days.
It can definitely feel that way, but each sanctions program has a specific purpose and is based on a particular law or executive order. They're not just making this shit up as they go along.
Okay, let's get back to the big picture. We've talked about different types of sanctions, the debate about their effectiveness, the humanitarian concerns, and the potential for blowback. But why should the average person give a shit about this sanction stuff? How does it affect us regular folks?
That's a great question. Sanctions can have a direct impact on our lives even if we don't realize it. For example, if the U.S. imposes sanctions on a country that produces a lot of oil, it can drive up gas prices here at home.
So sanctions can hit us right in the wallet. Now you're talking my language.
And it's not just about economics. Sanctions can affect our freedom to travel, communicate, and even access information.
Right, because if the U.S. sanctions a country, we might not be able to visit or do business with people there.
Exactly. And if sanctions lead to conflict or instability in other parts of the world, it can have ripple effects that we feel here at home. Things like increased immigration or even the threat of terrorism.
So basically what happens in other countries doesn't stay in other countries anymore.
That's right. We live in a globalized world, and what happens in one part of the world can have far-reaching consequences.
Okay, so sanctions can affect our wallets and our freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
But can we just sit back and let the government decide who to punish? Can we do anything about it?
Absolutely not. It's important for citizens to be informed about sanctions and to engage in the debate about their use. You can contact your elected officials and let them know your views on sanctions. You can support organizations that are working to promote human rights and peace in countries that are affected by sanctions. And you can educate yourself and others about the complexities of this issue.
Right, because knowledge is power. The more we understand about sanctions, the better equipped we are to challenge their misuse and hold our leaders accountable.
Exactly. We need to be having these conversations, even if they're uncomfortable or challenging.
Well, I gotta say, this is some eye-opening shit. I never realized how much power the U.S. has over the global economy and how much damage they can do with sanctions.
It's a complex issue, and there are no easy answers. But I hope this conversation has helped to understand the different perspectives and the potential consequences of this powerful tool.
Well, thanks for dropping some knowledge on us.
You know, it's fascinating how this whole sanctions thing ties into the idea of the U.S. acting as the global police.
Yeah, we touched on that before. It's kind of messed up, right? The U.S. thinking they can just tell everyone what to do.
Well, it's not quite that simple. The U.S. has immense power.
That's for sure.
And with that comes a certain responsibility, at least in their eyes. They see themselves as having a duty to intervene when international peace or security is threatened, even if it pisses off other countries.
So they're like the world's self-appointed hall monitor, except they've got nukes. But why does it always have to be the U.S.? Don't we have the UN and other international organizations for that kind of stuff?
Those organizations do play a role, but they often rely on the U.S. for support, financially, militarily, and diplomatically. And let's be real, sometimes the U.S. just prefers to go it alone, especially when they don't have the backing of the international community.
Like when they invaded Iraq. That didn't exactly turn out to be a shining example of global policing, more like a clusterfuck.
There are definitely examples where U.S. intervention has been controversial and even harmful, but sometimes sanctions have achieved positive outcomes, like pressuring countries to release political prisoners or stop human rights abuses.
Okay, so it's not all black and white. Sometimes sanctions might be justified and sometimes they're just bullshit. But isn't there a risk that the U.S. is making more enemies than friends with this whole sanctions game?
That's a valid concern. When the U.S. uses sanctions aggressively, it can definitely damage relationships and alienate other countries, even close allies.
And it seems hypocritical, right? The U.S. preaching about freedom and democracy while also trying to control what other countries do. It's like they want to have their cake and eat it too.
That's a point a lot of critics make. They argue that the U.S. needs to be more consistent in its actions and values if it wants to be seen as a credible leader on the world stage.
So basically they need to put their money where their mouth is.
Exactly. They need to listen more to their allies and work collaboratively instead of just dictating terms.
Yeah, that would probably make things a lot less fucked up.
Speaking of things getting fucked up, this whole sanctions thing has also led to this trend of de-dollarization.
Oh yeah, we talked about that earlier, how other countries are starting to ditch the U.S. dollar because of all this sanctions bullshit.
Right. And it's not just a few rogue states. Even some of America's closest allies are exploring alternatives to the dollar.
Why is that? Is it just because they're pissed off about secondary sanctions?
That's a big part of it. Countries don't want to be at the mercy of the U.S. Treasury Department. They want to be able to trade freely without worrying about getting hit with sanctions for doing business with the wrong people.
Makes sense. So what are they using instead of the dollar? Are they trading in Bitcoin now or something?
It's a mix of things. Some countries are using their own currencies for bilateral trade. Others are turning to gold as a safe haven asset. And there's even talk of creating new international reserve currencies. Maybe even a digital currency backed by a basket of commodities.
Whoa, a digital currency backed by gold. That sounds like some futuristic sci-fi shit.
It might sound crazy, but it's becoming more and more likely as the U.S. continues to use the dollar as a weapon.
So by trying to control the world with sanctions, the U.S. might actually end up losing control of the global financial system. Talk about irony.
It's a real possibility. The more the U.S. uses sanctions, the more incentive other countries have to find ways to bypass the dollar.
I could backfire big time.
And it could have serious consequences for the U.S. economy. If the dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency, it could lead to inflation, higher interest rates, and a decline in living standards for average Americans.
Damn, so we could all end up paying the price for this sanctions shit. That's fucked up.
It's definitely a risk. And it's not just about economics. A decline in the dollar's dominance could weaken U.S. military power and diplomatic influence. They could lose their seat at the head of the table, so to speak.
So the U.S. could end up shooting itself in the foot with all these sanctions. Talk about a cell phone.
It's a possibility we can't ignore. It's crucial to consider the potential consequences, both intended and unintended, before slapping sanctions on another country.
This is some deep shit, man.
Huh?
I'm starting to feel like we're living in some dystopian novel where the U.S. is the evil empire, trying to control everything.
It's important to remember that there are many different perspectives on this issue. Some people genuinely believe that sanctions are a necessary tool for promoting U.S. interests and values. Others see them as a form of imperialism and overreach.
Yeah, it's not like the U.S. has a monopoly on being the bad guy.
Exactly. Many countries use sanctions to some extent, but the U.S. is by far the most frequent user.
And they're not afraid to get creative with it. I mean, we've talked about the SDN list, but there are all sorts of other weird and wonderful sanctions programs out there.
Oh, yeah. The U.S. has a whole arsenal of sanctions tools at their disposal. It's like a giant menu of ways to fuck with other countries.
So it's not like they're just pulling these sanctions out of their ass.
So sometimes it might feel that way, but generally there's a legal basis for these sanctions. Even if it's not always clear or justifiable, they're usually based on some law or executive order.
All right, let's bring this back to the real world. We've talked about all these different types of sanctions, the debate about whether they work, the humanitarian concerns, and the potential for blowback. But what does this all mean for the average person? Why should we give a shit about this sanction stuff?
That's a great question. I think there are a few reasons why this matters to everyone, not just politicians and diplomats. First, sanctions can have a direct impact on our lives, even if we don't realize it.
Like how? Give me an example.
Sure. Let's say the U.S. imposes sanctions on a country that produces a lot of oil. That can lead to higher gas prices here at home, hitting everyone in the wallet. Or if sanctions disrupt global supply chains, we might see shortages of certain goods or price increases on everyday products.
So sanctions can screw with our wallets and make it harder to buy stuff.
Hmm.
Okay, now I'm paying attention.
And it's not just about economics. Sanctions can also affect our freedom to travel, communicate, or even access information.
Right, because if the U.S. sanctions a country, it might become a lot harder to visit or do business with people there. It's like they're putting up a wall.
Exactly. And if those sanctions lead to conflict or instability in other parts of the world, it can have ripple effects that we feel here at home, like increased immigration or even the threat of terrorism.
So basically, what happens in other countries doesn't stay in other countries anymore. We're all connected,
Right.
for better or worse.
That's right. We live in a globalized world, and we can't just ignore what's happening in other parts of the world. What happens over there can affect us over here.
Okay, so sanctions can impact our wallets and our freedoms. But is there anything we can do about it? Can we just sit back and let the government decide who to punish and who to reward? Or do we have a say in this whole sanctions game?
You absolutely have a say. It's important for citizens to be informed about sanctions and to engage in the debate about their use. Don't just accept what you hear from the government or the media. Do your own research, challenge assumptions, and ask tough questions.
So we can't just sit back and let the government call the shots. We need to be informed and speak up.
Exactly. It's our responsibility to hold our leaders accountable and make sure they're not abusing this powerful tool. You can contact your elected officials and let them know your views on sanctions. You can support organizations that are working to promote human rights and peace in countries that are affected by sanctions. And you can educate yourself and others about the complexities of this issue.
Right, because knowledge is power. The more we understand about sanctions, the better equipped we are to challenge their misuse and push for more responsible and ethical foreign policy.
Exactly. We need to be having these conversations, even if they're uncomfortable or challenging.
Well, I gotta say, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener. I never realized how much power the U.S. has over the global economy and how much damage they can do with sanctions.
It's a complex issue, and there are no easy answers. But I hope this conversation has helped you understand the different perspectives and the potential consequences of this powerful tool.
Well, thanks for dropping some knowledge on us. We're gonna take a quick break, grab another beer, and come back for the final round of the Sanctions Showdown. Stay tuned, you beautiful bastards.
All right, we're back for the final round of this sanctions showdown. We've spent the last hour or so talking about how the U.S. uses sanctions to basically fuck with anyone who gets on their bad side. But let's wrap this shit up with some real talk. Are these sanctions actually making the world a better place?
That's the million-dollar question.
Or are we just creating more chaos and pissing everyone off?
There's no easy answer.
Well, try me. Sanctions are a complex tool, and like any tool, they can be used for good or evil. It all comes down to who's wielding the hammer and what their motives are.
So are you saying the U.S. is just using sanctions to be a dick?
Not always.
Or are they genuinely trying to make the world a better place?
I think it's a mix of both. Sometimes sanctions are used for purely selfish reasons to protect U.S. economic interests or punish countries that don't toe the line.
Like when they sanctioned Iran because they didn't like their nuclear program?
Exactly.
That always felt like a dick move to me.
That's a prime example.
Yeah.
But there are also times when sanctions are used to try to promote human rights, democracy, or peace.
Oh, okay. I see what you mean.
It's a blunt instrument, for sure, but it can be used to try and nudge countries in the right direction.
So it's all about who's calling the shots and what their agenda is. That's a pretty cynical view of the world, man.
Maybe, but it's the reality of international politics. That's why it's so important for citizens to be engaged in this debate. We can't just blindly trust our leaders to use sanctions responsibly. We need to hold their feet to the fire and make sure they're not abusing this power.
Right, because if we just let them do whatever the fuck they want, we could end up in a world where everyone is sanctioned and the global economy goes to shit.
That's not entirely out of the realm of possibility. The more we rely on sanctions as the go-to tool for dealing with international problems, the more we risk creating a world that's divided, unstable, and ultimately less free.
Damn, that's a pretty bleak outlook. So what's the takeaway here? What do we do with all this knowledge about sanctions?
The most important thing is to stay informed and engage in critical thinking. Don't just accept everything you hear from the government or the media. Do your own research, challenge assumptions, and ask tough questions.
Right, because blind trust got us into this mess in the first place. We need to be our own watchdogs, our own bullshit detectors.
Exactly. And remember, sanctions are just one tool in a much larger toolbox. There are other ways to address international conflicts and promote peace diplomacy, development aid, cultural exchange. We need to be thinking about the bigger picture and not just relying on sanctions as a quick fix for every problem.
So basically, we need to be smarter and more strategic about how we use sanctions, not just throwing them around like confetti at a goddamn parade.
Exactly. Sanctions can be a powerful tool, but they're not a silver bullet. They should be used sparingly and strategically and only as a last resort.
Well, this has been one hell of a deep dive. We've explored the dark side of U.S. foreign policy, learned about the different ways they can fuck with other countries, and debated whether it's all just a giant power trip.
We've barely scratched the surface of this complex and controversial issue, but hopefully it's given our listeners a better understanding of how sanctions work and the potential consequences of their use.
All right, you beautiful bastards. It's time to wrap this shit up. We've learned that the U.S. has this massive arsenal of sanctions at their disposal. But are they really making the world a better
That's
place?
something to think about.
Or are they just creating more enemies and fucking things up even more? We'll leave you to ponder that. And don't forget to subscribe to our show for more mind-blowing deep dives into the stuff that actually matters. We'll be back next week with another episode that's guaranteed to make you think, laugh, and maybe even question everything you thought you knew about the world. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay pissed off. Peace out.